This is your course, Understanding Your Career Options, where we want to cover on this some tips, recommendations, how we decide for the right career path in life science, a little bit more details in how is the career of biochemist, how is the day-to-day routine, how's the day-to-day job, what's the salary, and most important was the salary range concept. It's very important when you're looking at salaries in life sciences career, and also a little bit of the career pathways and career lifetime. So you're feeling like this, right? If you're coming from a graduate studying life science, you don't know which pathway to follow because money might be important, pleasure might be important, and you know how to wait. So it's very important. It is normal the situation you are now. Everybody's lost in the beginning. Step number one is to develop and work in self-awareness. So pretty much know yourself. And some basic questions, just go through it. Ask yourself, what's your favorite subject in school? What's your main skills? What are you good at? Where do you see yourself working? And what is most matters to you? If it's job satisfaction and be happy, or if it's money, if it's both. So it's really a combination of different factors that you have to make yourself those questions. And maybe to give a more concrete example, let's walk through a very simple example um, where you like science. So that's your example. Is if you like science, you have um, you prioritize biology and chemistry. Those are your two favorite subjects in school, and you can see yourself working in a lab. You can see yourself working in a lab environment. So the combination of those two might lead to most likely a career in research, where you can combine both knowledge and the pleasure in biology and chemistry, plus work in the lab. And in research, the most recommended career, the clear or the most clear pathway is a career as a scientist. So as a scientist, let's take an example, a biochemist. Biochemist, what they usually do, they study like chemical and physical principles of living things, a lot of biological process, cell development, growth, disease. The work environment is typically there are three main environments. You're either working in research and development for whatever organization, if it's a government or non-government organization. You work in a university in a research, so pretty much the academia life, or you work in a pharmaceutical company. So those are pretty much the three environments. And number one, research that can be in a company, can be in a biology company, a pesticide, or any type of company. There's a good job outlook in terms of growth. So until 2026, is the job growth be probably 10% in a year. Typical routine of a biochemist, you do a lot of research. So you study what's going on in the current published data and scientific literature. You typically your experiments, you're always working with hypotheses. So you let's take your example. You think the substance A, an extract from the plant, has anti-cancer property. That's a research hypothesis. It's a research question. You perform experiments. So you're going to test substance A against in vitro models in cells or in mice. You can test different scenarios where that substance, where you're testing that hypothesis, and then after you test it on different type of hypothesis, you come to analyze the report and you come with your conclusions. So there's a typical, let's say, mindset that the research in the biochemistry would be. Routine would look like very similar to this. You wake up, you have a lab team meeting where you're meeting the lab supervisor and the other lab staff. In the morning, you start preparing experiments. You study protocol, which is pretty much the receipt, how you're going to perform that experiment, which reagents you're going to use, the materials, the equipment, and see if everything is free, prepared, and then if you can use it. So you run your experiment 10 to 11:30. You collect the first samples, you put them to measure in whatever measure equipment, and you go break for lunch. After lunch, you collect the samples, you clean the materials, you put everything back in place, and you have the first results. And in the afternoon, maybe if the results are already available, you start evaluating and preparing the report for discussion with your supervisor. That's a typical like 1 day experiment. And it might be that you start experiment day one on Monday and just finish the end results on Friday. Really depends on the life cycle of the experiment. This is a typical way. Sorry. You start, you prepare, and then you collect and you analyze the results. What type of skills you need? So you need highly communication skills. You need to report. You need to know how to discuss your experiment. You need math to calculate to process the data. You need to be very detail oriented. You need to understand how to evaluate the data. And when you prepare an experiment, it's very like you sometimes this is a nano whatever micro whatever magnitude you're using. So you have to be very precise when you're preparing it, and you have to be very good at problem solving as well. Now another important concept, the salary range concept. Many students they ask how much you can make, how much money you can make as a biochemist, as a pharmacist, as whatever. There's no precise question. There is a range. And here we're going to learn a little bit more how to understand this range and how to choose career according to, or let's say gear up your career according to this range. So there are three main variables that influences on the salary. Let's talk like the first one is degree. If you have a bachelor degree or if you have a advanced degree, which goes to PhD and MBA. So there will be a range from entry level to what we call the more premium level as a more advanced degree. Would be also depending on experience. So the entry level is typical until 2 years experience. Premium, where you are like a more senior, like a senior scientist, you are above 10 years of experience. There's also the fact of location, and there's a fact of international location and also domestic location. If you take, for example, US, United States as an example, salary in California, San Francisco, or New York City is not the same salary as in Tennessee, in or Nashville, or whatever other Midwest location. So we're talking here different level of cost of living, different level of competition, and different level of salaries as well. The same as the salary in Hyderabad in India is not the same salary as Basel in Switzerland. So we're talking about also international locations, really highly dependent. They can be 2 to 5 times different. Well, let's say as an example, we take here United States as an example. Using those variables in the United States, your salary range can go from 40,000 if you're on an entry level to 120,000 if you like more high end of the range. So they're like 3 times more. There's a huge difference, right? It's very difficult to say precisely how you're gonna make as a biochemist. It's gonna depend on those three main variables. Here a little bit of the range for some of the scientist positions. So a molecular biologist and biochemists are highly like wanted in the market. They range for the entry level for beginning 40s until maybe end of the 90s, beginning of the hundreds. The same for chemists, microbiologists, and food scientists. I think one of the things that biochemists offer, they are very have broad, let's say, background, so they can move to other functions. If you go in a microbiologist major, probably you're more restricted and more specified to that area. The typical biochemist career path is if you're in the entry level, let's take here's an example, you just finish your master, you have an option to go to the academia. So you'd go for a PhD degree, you go to a postdoc, and then you enter as assistant professor, associate professor, then a full-time professor. So that's the typical pathway in the United States for a job, a non-industry job. If you decide to go to the industry, pathway would be you start as a scientist. If you stay in the research and development, you might go to a senior scientist, and then you have a manager where you have staff, where you manage an area or function in the domain area. Let's say you're the R&D manager for the preclinical development, and then you go to a higher level, which is a director level. You might have more sections, more sectors, until you I think probably the highest level is a VP, for example, VP of R&D. So you're managing all sections for R&D, preclinical, clinical, and all the phases from the research. That's like kind of the highest rank for a research scientist in the industry. In a clinical, like in a hospital situation, typically you start as an analyst, you're a supervisor, so you're in charge of managing other people. You go same as a director and VP as well. Question that people make is how long you have to wait until you go from one level to another. Is really dependent on which pathway you follow. Is dependent on the structure of the organization. I think here is important just to give a perspective. In academia, there's a typical average pathway. You take a 46 years to finish your PhD and have another 1 2 years to finish your postdoc. Start as assistant professor, 6 to 8 years to get to a tenure track of 2 years associate. So it could take 18 years to go for a PhD or start level to a full-time professor. That's highlight is not 100% of the people they get there. Many of them they get stuck at this, as associate professor or as assistant professor. So there's a very low. Let's say there's not many jobs for everyone in the academia. So it's important to understand this: the 18 years plus a low probability to reach there. So as a scientist, you have the pathway number one. If you don't want to do management, you can be a senior scientist. That's the pathway typical pathway of the industry. You stay as a senior scientist, and then we evolve to a principal scientist, where you have a lot of projects that are going on. You have your name on the papers and first name on the papers. On the pathway number two, you go in a more managerial level. You go from scientist to manager, and then for a director. So you don't have to go always to follow the managerial if you don't feel like you have skills or you don't feel comfortable managing people and managing situations. You rather go for really the hardcore, stay in hardcore science. You go for scientist